Share screen. That's me. This is awkward silence to start with. All right, so getting started right here. We're going to pull up this PowerPoint. All right, starting right here with the American Revolution. Now, interesting, got the painting up here. You know, who are these cats? Most, you should be able to recognize at least two of these figures on this painting. Who can we recognize? As my little cursor's not working, but who can we recognize up there? You got the skullet. All right, you got Benjamin Franklin, the skullet. You got beside him, you got the author of the Declaration of Independence, who is Thomas Jefferson. You got Thomas Jefferson. And then over here, if my cursor would actually work, there it is. You got John Adams over here, okay? So you got Adams, you got Jefferson, you got Franklin. They were on the committee to write the Declaration. And of course, Jefferson's the one that's going to do this. So these guys are larger than life. They're figures. There's monuments made to these cats. Maybe not so much to John Adams, but there's a lot of monuments to these characters, right? They're larger than life people that are up there on a pedestal, so to speak. All right. Hence, background to the American Revolution in itself and how we remember it. Now, here's kind of the big essential question going forward for this week. Right. It's kind of thinking about how revolutionary was the American Revolution. Right. So how revolutionary was the American Revolution? Because when we put into, if you're going to define what a revolution should be, what kind of ideas come to your mind? What is it for something to be a revolution? Yes, Tucker. Change the government. Okay, keep going. Okay, way of doing things and thinking. Okay, but don't we do that every day? What would make changing the government and change of thoughts a revolution? What would it take? There you go. We're looking for those words, right? So a major political change, possibly, major social and economic change, possibly, and usually these revolutions are kind of earth-shaking, right? Which the American Revolution definitely was that, right? But generally speaking, when we say other revolutions, what's some other revolutions that you think of? French Revolution. And we always want to compare our revolution to the French Revolution, the communist revolutions of China in the 1930s and 40s, or whether the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And all of those revolutions were very violent, bloody, huge change taking place, right, in society. We always compare it to that. So French Revolution, Robespierre, what happened to Marie Antoinette? Yeah, not enough cake for folks. She said eat cake. There wasn't enough cake. I was promised cake. You got to go. I didn't get my cake. All right. You got to go. All right. So you got a major change that's going to take place. So in American Revolution, were the ones that started this revolution, did they really have those types of changes in mind in the American Revolution? Right. And what we're going to see here is the American Revolution. This is really bizarre for us. It is a top-down revolution. If you think of the pyramid, right, you think of society being a pyramid between, which we're going to use kind of a Marxist term here, the haves and the have-nots. And if you think of a pyramid, where would the haves be? They're up here. Maybe a little bit more have some. So we have the haves, the sums, and the have-nots, right? And the have-nots are the big ones, correct? So if you look at the French, you look at the Bolshevik, you look at the Chinese revolutions, and it was what? A bottom to the top revolution, which means that the folks at the bottom were revolting because, keep going. Okay, good. So that's a good way to look at it. So they could not get to the top. So they were being so oppressed, right? The ones at the bottom were so oppressed and so angry and became unified in their thoughts of oppression and not being able to move up the ladder, so to speak, that they totally wanted to change society and pretty much all of these violently change society, right, in some form or fashion. Our revolution was a top-down revolution. It makes us really unique in the sense that we strive out for our independence, and then we try to create this American identity, this American patriotism, this American nationalism. And what these guys did right here with this document is what helps to kind of fortify our patriotism and our nationalism and our identity of who we are, is the Declaration. So it's really weird. So when you look at these cats and all these funny looking dudes right here, all right, did they really want to alter society to a radical form of change? They did not. So it's top down. So that makes us a little unique at this time. So technically, the question we should ask ourselves then is that should the American Revolution be called a revolution, or should it be called a war for independence? We're going to let it hang on out there. All right, could be some good stuff. Right now, we're going to go. Of course, we're going to dive through this and kind of look at what's going on and what they were trying to accomplish and what was happening at the time period, and then we will look at well, it is going to be somewhat revolutionary in the context of the time period, right? And that's why you guys are doing y'all's group projects. We're going to look at women. We're going to look at African Americans and talk about other groups that are out there and how they were going to be impacted by this. Cool beans. So, all right. So that's how we're going to start here. Now, again, you guys have covered this stuff a lot. So there's not a whole lot of need for us to go into a lot of details of specifics of, what was going on. And we already talked about this. And this is the last thing that we covered was, remember, coming out of the French and Indian War, the colonists are ecstatic. Just one, it opened up all this new land. It just reaffirmed the fact that Great Britain was the dominant country out there. They own all this amazing amounts of land. Life is great. The economy is going to be booming again, right? Going to make more money. Life's going to be awesome. But on the Parliament side of things, they're like, well, wait a second. This thing costs a whole lot of money to fight this thing. We've got this brand new empire. We're going to keep all these troops here, right? Because again, remember before the French and Indian War, how often did the colonists see a British soldier? They're not going to see it if you're at a port, maybe, if you're like in a city, a larger, metropolitan area, possibly, if you want to use that word loosely, metropolitan, because there's only a handful of those things. You might see some tax collectors here and there, but there's not going to be that many because how many taxes are out there? There's not many that are out there, right? So American Revolution, pre-tax crisis, pre-French and Indian War, and colonists are rocking and rolling, loving life, loving that salutary neglect, right? And even when the war's over with, they just thought that was going to continue. But what does Great Britain say? Maybe not, all right? Because again, we got all these troops over here. We need to raise money. We can't raise, any more taxes on the folks at home to pay for these overseas ventures. And if there's 1 million plus colonists over here, it's time for those cats to start paying their fair share, right? So the other problem is that's when they go to reassess the actual, what they have and how they run the system. They're like, dude, we're letting so much money slip through the cracks. We're going to have to tighten controls up a little bit in order to make enough revenue to recoup the losses that we had in the French and Indian War, and also to maintain these troops over here in the colonies. Now, these troops are going to be heavily resented by the colonists almost from the get-go. It's just like kind of, with the soldiers being there and with the taxation crisis going on, it's only going to exacerbate the problem. All right, it's only going to make things worse. Okay, we already know about the proclamation trying to keep the colonists on the coastline, keep them under control. They don't go into Native American land, and they won't cause problems. Right, so we got that one right there. So all those things right there we just said about making them tighten the control up, maintain the try to mercantilistic ideas, try to continue with those as well, make the colonists pay their fair share. Only common sense. You're enjoying the benefits of the freedoms, the economic prosperity that's going to be out there. It just makes some sense. So the one thing that we love to do is we love to come down hard on Parliament in Great Britain and how they reacted at this time period to what's going to occur. But really, should we? Well, maybe. But then on the other hand, you can kind of understand their perspective, right? And what they're trying to do as well. All right, so keep that in mind as we keep going forward. Now, remember, and this is important. So this is the map that we just had on our last test as well, right? We got all this land. There's, of course, a proclamation line trying to keep everybody under control. All right, so we got that, right? So here's the thing, and we talked about this before. Now, here's the thing. And this is where we got to be careful as we're even moving through the 1760s, into the early 1770s. At what point are the colonists from the top and getting the rest of the folks involved. At what point are they finally going to say, man, enough's enough, right? Enough's enough. When is it going to be where they're going to say, hey, we need our independence? How many folks are thinking independence in 1763? Very, very few. All right, very, very few. They're happy. Did they mind the Navigation Acts? Did they mind the Molasses Act from 1730s? Not really, because, well, they just ignored it. Okay. Are they going to mind some of the taxes that are on external things? Not really. All right. Not really. We've got, of course, the Hat Act, the Woolen Act, and all that stuff. They didn't bother. They didn't bother. All right. So Navigation Acts, they didn't mind it anyway, because where they're going to trade with Great Britain, they're going to trade with England anyway. It's the most prosperous country. It's where you can get the best materials, the best prices. So they're going to trade that way with them anyway. And the smuggling allowed them to get other stuff in when they needed to without paying that taxes. All right. So you do that, have that going on. Now, problem is, and this is where it comes, is that the new taxes that pop up in 1764. Now, remember on the list that I gave you well before the hurricane break, that listed the ones after the war to try to tighten controls. Now, the Sugar Act, 1764, this was to stop smuggling. So it went back and looked at the Molasses Act and lowered the tax from 6 pence to 3 pence. So it actually lowered the tax. And here's the crazy thing. The Sugar Act remains intact, in place throughout the 60s going into the early 70s, meaning that the colonists paid this tax. All right. But again, this fit the idea that, what was the authority that Parliament had over the colonies in trade, external, imports, exports, things of that nature, especially maybe imports, exports as well as possibly. That's okay. All right. And, they still could smuggle around it when they could. All right. But the one, obviously, and you guys know about this, big time, is the Stamp Act. Right. So the Stamp Act, one, you guys have covered that since elementary school. What was the Stamp Act? But not just the stamp was on the paper, right? So the Stamp Act was the official papers, right? So that you had to have. So if you had a newspaper, if you were going to print legal documents, whether it be legal, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage license, property deeds, lawsuits, that's all on one side of things. On the other, newspapers, playing cards, all of those other things as well. Those are all are going to be, have to have this special paper tax that you're going to pay on that kind of thing, right? Is this something brand new that Parliament in England just decided to, and we're going to come up with this random tax and create something? No, they got something like this that's already in England, so they're just bringing it across the pond. All right, and put it into place over here. And they even gave them like so many months to get ready for it. To say, oh yeah, it's going to go into effect on this date. All right, so you can prepare for it. All right, and we know from elementary school, and if you watched Liberty Kids on PBS, like growing up, whatever it might be, something like that. Liberty Kids. Yeah, some good shows, man. Good shows. If you go from there, what are these cats immediately going to do? Starting at the top, starting with the merchants, starting at the ones that would be impacted the most. Was it the common folks out there that organized rallies and stuff? No, it was the guys at the top that organized, all right, stuff like this in newspapers. And here it is. You can see it up at the top. My cursor just does not want to show up from time to time. It's crazy. So there it is right there, that famous, this is the place to fix the stamp, right? Almost from the get-go, opposition is going to start with what's the big phrase? No taxation without representation, right? That's the one that you always see. You can always kind of fall back on that. But is it that simple? Maybe not. All right, maybe not. So what did they do? First of all, you're going to have this guy. So what is there going to be the organized opposition to the Stamp Act, and the tax is going to be out there? We've got this guy. This guy is Samuel Adams, right? What group is he going to help form in Boston? And you're going to see this group of middle class merchants and political leaders that's going to help to organize the resistance. Sons of Liberty, all right, very famous, right? Sons of Liberty. Generally, we champion these Sons of Liberty as what? As heroes, right? Well, let's see what they did. All right, I think, well, let's just look. All right, so one thing New York merchants, other merchants are going to start this idea of a boycott. All right. And here comes the Sons of Liberty. So to enforce this boycott, the Sons of Liberty and all the different towns are going to organize the opposition to stop merchants from selling and importing or exporting goods to Great Britain. What's some of the tactics that they used? It says, which means usually when you intimidate folks, you do that quite, you're forcefully doing these things. Which means you're talking about you get a group of folks that they go to the different merchants and make sure that they're going to comply with the boycott. All right. Now, good example of this, you can look at the governor of Boston at the time period. One of these groups, fired up by the Sons of Liberty, made it to the governor's house and they wanted to protest the Stamp Act. Like, you better not do this. Guess what happened? They broke out his windows of his home. Right. And when that wasn't good enough, they broke into his home and stole some of his stuff. Do you think Samuel Adams was in that mob, that group? Nope. Yeah, John Adams is his cousin. John Adams is going to refer to the Sons of Liberty as being a mob. All right, a mob. And he says this stuff's kind of going a little bit too far, all right, when it happened. So interesting, very patriotic group that protested quite violently at times and used force and intimidation. And what's the other one that we got up here that you might recognize, the phrase? Tar and feather. Yeah, and usually the tar would be around the docks, right? Because tar is going to be used to fix the boats and ships and all that kind of good stuff down there at the docks. So they would take, essentially, if you were a tax collector or somebody, they would pour tar on, first they'd strip you, pour tar on top of it, which is hot, right? And it would obviously stick to your body. It wouldn't kill you, but when they peeled it off of you, it'd probably take off some skin. And they just pour feathers on you, and then they parade you through the street on a rail, all right, for just the humiliation, all right, of going through that kind of thing. Pretty nice. Now, how much tar and feathering actually took place? And this isn't something new. It had been going on in the past, all right, not so much over here, but it had been going on in England and elsewhere. We don't have a whole lot of documentation on that. Of a lot of this tar and feathering taking place, but there is documents that some did happen in the late 1760s. But just the simple fact that they could threaten you with that would generally be enough, right? Mob comes up, threatens to do that. Okay, right? You kind of go in line. Patriotic. What about the poor folks out there who were, well, dude, it's my livelihood. If I don't trade, I don't make money, I lose my business, my home, my livelihood. What about those folks? Maybe they're very upset, but maybe the economics comes in on it. I don't know. Just something to think about as we keep going forward. But for the most part, Sons of Liberty by principle, yes. I mean, standing up for that idea of no taxation without representation is definitely something that we need to stand up for. All right. But it's also an interesting thing to note, though, is that our country is founded on the idea of violent protest. Violent protest. Think about that when we look about, of course, what's going on in the United States today. It's a lot of violent protests going on. Protest of one that's violent and shouldn't happen, but then on the flip side of that is also something that needs to be done for that particular group. No judging, just saying what it is. Now, the other big thing, and this is really, really important, all right, to know what the Stamp Act Congress is. Know this one, okay, without a doubt. Now, what can we link this to? Remember we said the Albany meeting here in 1754, that the colonies led by Benjamin Franklin are going to meet in Albany to discuss Confederation type of ideals to pull together some type of defense. Flip the script, 10 years later, there's a crisis taking place. Delegates are going to be sent to New York to discuss what to do. All right. And these are the political leaders, the top down, right? The political leaders at the top are all going to meet and say, here's what we need to do. One, we need to boycott. And we also need to make a list of grievances and send it over to Parliament, which is also one of the things about our revolution is that we send, this revolution's, other than the Sons of Liberty and the violent aspect of it, we fight this revolution, at least to begin with pamphlets and speeches. in Enlightenment ideology. John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all right? Montesquieu, really cool names, right? We fight with those because anybody and everybody who was a somebody, all right, was going to write a pamphlet about this issue, about what's going on. All right, from John Adams on up the line to Alexander Hamilton a few years after this. All right, everybody's going to get involved in it. All right, so let's look and see what they said in their Declaration of Rights and Grievances. First, here's the tar and feathering. Kind of give you an idea. This is a hodgepodge type of deal, showing you the tea. You know, get the Tea Party in the background. You got the guy being tarred and feathered. What's this guy? What do they look like they're doing? And they're having a good old time. It's almost like rolling a house, man. It starts out as like just nice, clean fun, and it turns out that there's salt and spray paint and all kind of really mean things that happen, right? And everybody's like just laughing it up, having a good old time, right? Mob mentality. John Adams said, "Shenane, this is bad stuff. We don't need to get these guys fired up." Okay, that's another one about that one. All right, so here's what I want to look at real quick. They definitely need to see this one. So here's the thing. In 1765, how many folks are talking independence? Yeah, you're not going to see it yet. There's no real need. So what do they say? Take a look at this one. So the members of this Congress, sincerely devoted with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government, inviolable attached to the present happy establishment of the Protestant succession. So what is he saying right there? We're devoted to king and parliament, king and country. All right, we're devoted. Humble subjects, go down here. His Majesty's subjects in these colonies, right? We have allegiance to the crown. And since we do, we are entitled to what? Yeah, we should not be treated as second-class citizens just because we are born in the colonies. Right, in the colonies. So we need those same rights and liberties. So what exactly are those rights and liberties? They're mainly talking about political and economic, all right, at this time period. A little bit of social, but definitely political rights, okay? And you keep going, and now here's the next one. One thing I definitely want to point out here. Cursor goes away. Look at number 3. Yes. Okay. So 1, it says freedom of people, undoubted right, Englishmen, no taxes shall be placed upon them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. Which representatives are they talking about? Their colonial representatives, all right? Next one's important. The people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot be represented in the House of Commons. So that shows you right then and there, already in 1765, the ones at the top who put this out there have already said what about representation? It can't happen. They cannot be represented in Parliament. So what do they want? They just want secretary-elect. They want the way it used to be. We don't want to send representatives over to Parliament. We can't be represented. All right. The only thing that we can actually be taxed by is our colonial assemblies. All right, and that's important to note right there. They're already saying this. So no taxes can be done. It's not constitutional by a humbug. All right, it can't happen. So that kind of puts a little idea about this no taxation without representation, then, doesn't it? So if that's the case, they can't be represented. Then when do they meet the next step? What's next? Right? If Parliament says we have sovereignty, we can. Colonists already in 65 say you can't. Would you say the die is already cast? Possibly. Now, there's a good one right here as well. Benjamin Franklin goes over to Parliament and goes over to London in 1766. And this is his transcript. He goes in front of Parliament and they ask him some questions about, what does it mean to be, what do the colonists think about, Americans think about being taxed and all these different things. And Benjamin Franklin has kind of turned the corner. In the early 60s here, he wanted to get a position in the British government over here, right? Some big position. He didn't get it. And then he starts to make that obvious thing that, well, maybe that's not the place for me, right? So he starts to kind of go from that I love Britain to changing his mind. And it's really good if you go and read the transcript of what he says. And basically he says right here that, no, we're not going to be taxed. We're going to boycott. Doesn't matter what you do to us. And he's already saying that in 66. All right. So that's a fun one to look at if you get a chance to. All right. Which I'm now nervous that I'm not going to be able to pull up my, maybe to shrink. Okay. It's still there. All right. So you still see more of that. So how does, real quick, we got 5 minutes. So what is Congress going to do? Congress, what is Parliament going to do? Parliament's going to reject the Stamp Act. And they say, okay, so it never went into effect. But they leave the Molasses Act, which is the Sugar Act of 1764. They leave that tax on molasses, but they pass the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act is going to say that Parliament has the right to legislate, which includes taxation, right? Legislate, which includes taxation, to the colonies. Because to them, now, they didn't actually say taxation. It says legislation in it, but to them, it doesn't matter whether you legislate or taxing, it's the same thing. You cannot question Parliament's authority here. All right, you cannot do so. Now, one thing that's going to be important, and I got that there, is this idea of virtual versus actual representation. Because with the Declaratory Act, Parliament asserts the idea of virtual representation. We love virtual, right? Virtual school, right? Virtual meetings, where you're not really there. So what is this virtual representation? Is Parliament says they represent everybody in their empire. So everything that's under the British flag, they represent you, whether you vote for them or not. Because here's the rub for them. What does it take to vote back then in England and to vote over here on your colonial assemblies? You had to own land and you had to be a white male. Well, what about women and what about propertyless men? Are they not represented? Parliament's going to say what? They are, right? Because Parliament, whether you elect these cats or not, they represent everyone, right? Which kind of makes some sense over here in the colonies too. But in this case, it ain't going to happen. One of the things that they're going to say, so the colonies are going to reject virtual representation and say by humbug. Why do you think they're going to reject virtual? And I forgot to point this one thing out. I'll come back to this one in just a second. Look at this one. I didn't read this last one, but read this right here. That the people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances, cannot be represented in the House of Commons. What are those local circumstances? Where's Parliament? Which there's a whole ocean in between. Which local circumstances with what we've got going on, the way we've developed, the way we are, there's no way that you can know any idea of what's going on over here. Right. But then at the same time, they also say we don't want to be represented. We don't want to send one of our folks over there to represent us either. Wow. Right. So essentially, what are they saying? Just leave us alone. Salary pay neglect work well. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. And Parliament's like, shenane. That ain't going to happen. All right. The money aspect of it is going to be too much. So now you know what's going to happen. So they reject virtual. They reject actual. Parliament's going to say you're virtually represented anyway. What do you think is going to happen in 1767? There's going to be a new tax. It just makes sense because Parliament is going to, rethink it, come up with a new tax, a round of taxes, and then these taxes are going to be, I know you can't see it right there, but these taxes are going to be on imported goods. The Townsend Acts are going to be on imported goods. So it's going to be more tariffs. It's going to be more taxes on trades, I should say. So it's going to tax tea and lead and paint and glass, right? So it says that. So tax on imported goods, paint, tea, glass, things like that, right? And what do you think the colonists are going to do? Boycott. Start kicking and screaming a little bit because it makes sense. Because when you look at the Declaratory Act, it's kind of like when you get in trouble and your parents take your phone away from you, but then you whine and complain enough and they get tired of listening to you and they hand you the phone back and to say, you better not do it again or I'm going to take that phone from you. You're probably going to do it again, aren't you? Because you know what's going to happen. If I whine and complain enough again, they're going to give me back my phone. So essentially, this part really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? What should Parliament have done right there at the very beginning? We're not going back. The Stamp Act's there. It's going to be enforced, and you're going to have to live with it. Because by doing this right here, what just happened? They've lost their authority. almost from the get-go, they've lost their authority and their sovereignty. Okay, so with that said, that ends up today's stuff, and we'll again, this is going to be out there for you guys to look at, and we're going to round this thing up and look at the Townsend Act and how things are going to escalate later on down the line. Okay, so with that said, that is the first day of the American